Alrighty. I prepare for a second to do my 1-minute rant because this is arguably my most fun part of the game and part of the show. The game, everything's a game to me, right? So, all right, 1-minute rant. We're going to set up so that when the minute clock on my little screen over here changes, we'll start. And having begun, then we will do exactly 60 seconds of the rant. Then I'll stop, and then we'll spend a few minutes talking about the rant. Alrighty, rock and roll, here we go. Today's rant is action magnets. Now, if you have been at the table of a roleplay group, and you were involved with an action as a player, and another person in the group hears your action, and then immediately starts to interact with the game master on how they would resolve it or what they would want to do in that specific scene, that person is an action magnet. You'll find these are more visually apparent when two or more sub-scenes or two or more player actions are separated by some distance, whether it be physical distance or maybe even temporal distance. So, for example, somebody's going to talk to a guard in the afternoon, but at dinner somebody else is going to be doing something else. If that third person who is watching the action throws their words in to either of those conversations without being directed to, that's an action magnet. Now, the reason why action magnets are so difficult to deal with is that an action magnet does three things. Number one, he's going to take the attention of the storyteller and game master, whether or not they allow him into the scene. So an action magnet, for example, usually this is a younger person and a younger player. Not always. It could be somebody with some experience as well, but it's somebody who feels like they have a particular expertise in the actions of that scene and think that they would handle it better, or they just want to be helpful, or they just want to be part of the action, and so they are definitely going to be pushing on it. And the point of the action magnet, the problem with the action magnet is that it's taking away from the player's action and literally taking the limelight away from the actor that is in the scene. And motion pictures, you don't have this activity because when somebody does that, you just call cut and throw them off the set and move on. But when you're in a role play session, it's a little more nuanced, more difficult to handle. I'll deal with that coming up, but I just wanted you to understand that my rant is against the action magnet personnel themselves, and now we'll spend the next 9 minutes going over what needs to be done to deal with an action magnet. All right. That concludes the 1-minute rant on action magnets, and we are going to now talk about action magnets. Now, I have been game mastering for, I think I calculated the other day, something like 12,000 players. And it doesn't matter how many players you have at the table. You could have 3, you could have 4, you could have 10. But you will inevitably have one or more people who are, especially when you're first starting the group together, who are so excited about what's going on in the scenes, what's going on in the game, that they forget that they're not there. They're not part of it. There's a great little video by Dead Gentleman Productions I could recommend, and I do recommend, called The Gamers. And if you haven't seen it yet, definitely go and look that video up. The Gamers is an amazing short film put together by college kids from Oregon, and it is amazing. And Dead Gentleman Productions is one of my favorite production companies, and the guys that are in that group will know, and a huge shout out to them. And if you go and visit any of their materials, make sure you give them a shout from Jonathan Albin. They'll know me as the game market guru. I was involved professionally in business for a long time. But the point is that in their film, there was a scene where the characters are all theoretically asleep, except for one person. That person's on guard and on watch. And when that person begins to interact with a sound they hear, each of the players starts to put in what their input would be in the case of somebody approaching the encampment. But all of them are asleep, but the one who is actually in the scene. The limelight is on that one individual, and the game master, the storyteller, wants input from that one person. That's what we're looking for, is what that person is going to do. But everybody else starts to chime in. In that video, it's really clever because the game master goes, "Stop it, you're asleep." And in the video portion of the game, of the show, where they're actually showing the characters in the game, they're all standing up, but the moment he says, "You're all asleep," and they all fall back down. Then he goes on to explain something else the players, the main player hesitates a bit. They all start to put in their commentaries again. They're all action magneting to the scene. And the game master again is say, guys, you're asleep. And again, all the characters fall down. But the point is that when the limelight is on a player, that's his moment to shine. And it's up to the other players to honor that and listen to the conflict, listen to it. They certainly have, as far as at my table, you have permission to hear those conversations, that action, but you can't interact with it. And so when you were talking about being an action magnet, what you're doing is you're sharing, you're stealing thunder. Matter of fact, we had a situation in the game where I created an object that could be found on a shelf in a store that was called Personal Thunder. And of course, then the joke was that one or more of the players who had been action magnets were accused of stealing the thunder of other people. But that's beside the point. The issue is that action magneting, especially early on in a role play experience, if you haven't done it before, is natural. It's perfectly obvious when the game master is expositing information that you as a player want to gather that information as well and want to interact with that. The downside is that you're taking away from the other person's experience and you're therefore hindering the flow of the scene. Now, advice to action magnets, and I'm looking at you action magnets right now. When you are an action magnet, what you are actually doing is you're taking away from somebody else's play experience and you're preventing them from dealing with the scene as they would see fit, and instead you're trying to insert yourself into that scene. I promise, as a game master, I promise that you will have your moment in the light as well, and you will definitely get a chance to interact with the information when it's provided by the player in the scene with you. Do what you can to, bite your knuckle, sit in your hands, whatever it takes to stay out of a scene of which you're no part. It's difficult. It happens, actually, the best of us will do it on occasion. But in a game session, the less action magneting that it gets done, the less interaction that is out of the story, non sequitur, whatever, the more those things are reduced, the more efficiently the time will be used, and the more likely you'll get your time to shine as well. Now, this is difficult for new and inexperienced players. So what I'm going to offer you is this piece of advice. When the storyteller is explaining the situation before he begins the actual interaction, make sure to clarify whether you're in the scene or not. Because once you have acknowledged that you're out of the scene, then you're more than willing to take notes, scribble down commentary, recommendations for the other players when they're out of the limelight and such, like things that you want to ask them and such. That's perfectly fine, because it's things that perhaps you as a player need to clarify on, but it doesn't necessarily include your character. It's also important to remember with presence of mind where your character is in the story. So if at the beginning of a private spotlight type scene, that you ask the storyteller, ask the game master, okay, where am I in this? Am I not in the scene? And if not, where I am? Because that way you'll have an idea of things like how long does the conversation take. You can actually look at your clock and say, okay, this has been going on for 15 minutes. Certainly by this time, I might have had a response, and therefore there'd be grounds for making a out-of-game character contact. But fundamentally, the easiest way to get past being an action magnet is to try to keep track of how much time you have in the spotlight and be aware of how much time you're getting versus other players. And it is a game master's prerogative when that occurs. But generally, every one of us, every storyteller out there, every game master out there wants to make sure that every player is serviced with what they need to get from the game, what they need as far as input, and they're not going to be intentionally leaving you out. So just realize that as an action magnet, those moments when you want to jump in but you know you're not there, keep out of it, because when it is your turn, you certainly don't want somebody else to action magnet stumble into your scene and botch out the interaction either. So I'm got to move on because I've got other things I need to cover, but just realize that the purpose of the action magnet argument, the reason why I'm ranting about action magnets, is that in a game session, it takes away from the individual play experience of a player, and it detracts from the overall time that the game master has to provide everybody with their time. So with that, we'll move on to other things, but I want to just thank you for paying attention to this. If you, by the way, if you like what you're hearing on the show, make sure you follow the channel, click the like button down below, and share it with your friends. Let them know, especially if you've had experience with an action magnet in your game. Leave me a comment so we can get an idea of what that is. Share how you handle these moments of an action magnet, and whether you see this in your own games as well. I think it'll really help others to be able to see that. Also, make sure you subscribe to the channel if you can, because it helps with the algorithm to get this out to more people as possible. And make sure you share it with your role-play games group to maybe even just open a discussion about action magnets. Maybe you're one and haven't been aware of it. Best way to find out is to open it up to conversation and share with us in the comments about that.